Canada, a land known for its beauty and kindness, hides a dark secret. Beneath the picturesque landscapes and the reputation for politeness, there lies a history that is both painful and haunting. For many years, the government took Indigenous children from their families. This was not a voluntary separation. It was a forced removal, sanctioned by policies that aimed to assimilate Indigenous peoples into the dominant culture. These children were forced to go to schools called residential schools. These institutions were established with the intent to civilize Indigenous children, stripping them of their native identities. These schools were supposed to teach the children, but they did something much worse. Instead of providing a safe learning environment, they became places of torment and suffering. They tried to take away the children's language, culture, and spirit. The very essence of who they were was under attack, as the schools sought to erase their Indigenous heritage. The schools were run like prisons. The children were subjected to strict, often brutal discipline, and their freedom was severely restricted. Children were punished for speaking their languages and practicing their traditions. Any attempt to hold on to their cultural roots was met with harsh consequences. Many children were abused physically, emotionally, and sexually. The trauma inflicted upon them left deep scars, both visible and invisible, that would last a lifetime. The pain and suffering they endured are a stain on Canada's history. The legacy of these schools is a dark chapter that continues to affect Indigenous communities to this day. We must never forget what happened in these schools. Remembering this history is crucial to understanding the present and ensuring that such atrocities are never repeated. The resilience of the survivors and their communities is a testament to their strength and spirit, and it is our responsibility to honor their stories and work towards reconciliation. One of these schools was Brandon's Indian Residential School in Manitoba. It opened in 1895 and closed in 1972. For almost 80 years, this school was a place of sorrow for many Indigenous children. The government said the school was a place to educate Indigenous children. They said it would help them succeed in Canadian society, but the real goal was to assimilate the children. The government wanted them to forget who they were and to adopt European culture. In the 1950s, something terrible happened at Brandon. The school became a place for cruel experiments on children. These experiments were done without consent from the children or their parents. One of these experiments involved ESP, or extrasensory perception.
Researchers from McGill University came to the school. They wanted to see if Indigenous children had special mental abilities. They used ESP cards with symbols like stars, circles, and squares. The children were forced to guess the symbols on the cards. If they guessed wrong, they were punished.
The ESP experiments at Brandon were not isolated incidents. Similar experiments were conducted at other residential schools across Canada. These experiments were unethical and caused further trauma to the children.
Experts and historians today condemn these experiments. They say the researchers took advantage of vulnerable children. The children were already traumatized by being taken from their families and forced to assimilate. The experiments added another layer of abuse and suffering.
The legacy of residential schools is still felt today. These institutions, which operated for over a century, aimed to assimilate Indigenous children by removing them from their families and communities. The impact of this forced separation and cultural erasure continues to reverberate through generations. Many survivors carry deep emotional, psychological, and spiritual scars. These wounds are not just personal, but are also collective, affecting the entire community. The pain and suffering experienced by those who attended these schools have left an indelible mark on their lives.
They struggle with addiction, mental health issues, and a sense of disconnection from their cultural roots. The trauma inflicted by the residential school system has led to a range of mental health challenges, including depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder, and difficulty forming healthy relationships. The disruption of family structures and the loss of parenting skills have had long-lasting effects, making it challenging for survivors to build and maintain healthy relationships with their loved ones. The trauma they experienced has been passed down through generations, impacting entire communities. This intergenerational trauma manifests in various ways, including substance abuse, domestic violence, and a pervasive sense of hopelessness.
The residential school system has had a devastating impact on Indigenous communities. The loss of language, culture, and identity has created a profound sense of dislocation and alienation among survivors and their descendants. It has led to the loss of language, which is a vital part of cultural identity. Many Indigenous languages are now endangered or have been lost entirely due to the suppression of cultural practices in these schools, culture and identity. The suppression of traditional practices and the imposition of foreign values have eroded the cultural fabric of Indigenous communities. It has created a cycle of poverty, as the disruption of education and economic opportunities has left many Indigenous people struggling to make ends meet, violence and despair. The legacy of residential schools is evident in the high rates of violence and social issues that plague many Indigenous communities today.
The Canadian government has acknowledged the horrors of residential schools and the profound impact they have had on Indigenous peoples. This acknowledgement is a crucial step towards reconciliation and healing, and issued a formal apology. In 2008, the Prime Minister of Canada delivered a historic apology, recognizing the suffering and injustices endured by residential school survivors. However, the healing process is ongoing. True reconciliation requires not only acknowledgement and apology, but also concrete actions to address the lasting impacts of this dark chapter in history. Indigenous communities continue to work towards healing and reclaiming their cultural heritage, but the journey is far from over. The forced removal of children from their families caused irreparable damage to Indigenous communities. Children were separated from their parents, grandparents, and siblings, often never to see them again. This caused a breakdown in family structures, cultural transmission, and traditional knowledge.
When children returned to their communities after years in residential schools, they were often strangers. They had forgotten their language and customs and struggled to reconnect with their families. The trauma they had endured often made it difficult for them to be parents themselves, perpetuating the cycle of abuse and dysfunction.
In recent years, Canada has begun to face the dark legacy of residential schools. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, established in 2008, has played a vital role in uncovering and documenting the truth about residential schools.
The Commission heard heartbreaking testimonies from survivors, collected historical documents, and issued a final report with 94 calls to action. These calls to action aim to address the ongoing legacy of residential schools and promote reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians.
Reconciliation is not just about acknowledging the past, but also about taking concrete steps to address the ongoing injustices faced by Indigenous peoples. This includes supporting Indigenous self-determination, investing in education, healthcare, and economic development, and working to eliminate systemic racism and discrimination.
Many Indigenous communities are leading the way in healing and revitalization. They are reclaiming their languages and cultures, revitalizing traditional practices, and working to heal the wounds of the past. Non-Indigenous Canadians have a responsibility to support these efforts and work towards a more just and equitable future for all.
Remembering the atrocities committed at residential schools is not about dwelling on the past, but about honoring the survivors and ensuring that such horrors never happen again. These schools were places of immense suffering, where children were forcibly taken from their families, stripped of their culture, and subjected to abuse. The impact of these experiences has rippled through generations, leaving deep scars on Indigenous communities. We must listen to the stories of survivors, learn from their experiences, and understand the profound pain they endured. Their voices are crucial in educating us about the true history of our nation. By hearing their stories, we acknowledge their resilience and strength, and we commit to standing with them in their healing journey, and work together to create a better future for Indigenous peoples. This involves not only recognizing past injustices, but also actively participating in the process of reconciliation. We must support initiatives that promote Indigenous culture, language, and traditions, and ensure that Indigenous voices are heard and respected in all areas of society.
The journey towards reconciliation is a long and challenging one, but it's a journey we must take together. By acknowledging the past, supporting Indigenous healing and fostering mutual respect, we can build a foundation for a more inclusive and equitable society. This journey requires the commitment of every Canadian as we work to dismantle systemic barriers and create opportunities for all. And working towards a more just and equitable future, we can ensure that the mistakes of the past are not repeated. This means advocating for policies that address the needs of Indigenous communities, investing in education and healthcare, and promoting economic opportunities that empower Indigenous peoples. We can honor the survivors of residential schools and create a better future for all Canadians. By coming together in solidarity, we can heal the wounds of the past and build a nation that truly reflects the values of justice, equality, and respect for all cultures. Let us commit to this collective responsibility for the sake of future generations and the betterment of our society.